You thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you? My voice came out steady, calm. Too calm. Natalie flinched. A split-second hesitation, just enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She wasn't prepared for this moment, not yet. I leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, watching her face like I was reading a busted engine for signs of a bad gasket. She wasn't good at hiding things. Never had been. That was the problem with people who lived in their heads too much. When reality finally caught up, they froze. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, brushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. That was her first mistake. The worst lie is one told too fast. I kept my voice even. Sure you do. The kitchen clock ticked behind me, slow and steady, the only sound in the room. I let the silence stretch. People rush to fill silence when they're guilty. She swallowed. Hugo, you're sleeping with him. Her breath hitched, just barely, but I saw it. She wasn't going to deny it now, not outright. The gears were turning in her head, trying to find an angle, a way to soften the blow, make herself look like the victim. I cut her off. Save it. I'm not here for an apology. I pushed off the counter, grabbed my coffee from the table. Took a sip. It tasted like nothing. I just wanted to see if you'd lie to my face. She exhaled, long and shaky, like the air had been knocked out of her. Hugo, I didn't. I don't need details. I don't care about excuses. I set the cup down, glanced at the sink. Dishes from last night still sat there. Her dishes. Not mine. I'd been eating at the shop more often, something I didn't even realize until now. Maybe I'd seen this coming. Maybe I just ignored it. Her voice got small. I didn't mean for it to happen. That made me laugh. A short, humorless sound. Right? You tripped and fell into his bed. Happens all the time. She flinched again, but I wasn't in the mood to soften the blow. I let her sit with it. She wiped at her face, but there were no tears. I felt alone. I picked up my keys, rolling them over my knuckles. So you fixed that by screwing some tattooed poet in a backroom somewhere? Her nostrils flared. She didn't like that. Good. You don't talk to me anymore, she shot back. You're always at the shop, always buried in work. It's like you don't even see me. I tilted my head, watching her. And you think this changes that? She blinked, silent. I nodded, pocketed my keys. I gotta open the shop. Her shoulders stiffened. That's it? What do you want? A fight? Some big dramatic scene? I shook my head. Not happening. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She thought she wanted a fight, but she didn't know what to do when she didn't get one. Some people need conflict to feel alive. I walked to the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at her. I'll be handling things my way. Then I left. The air outside was crisp, the kind of early November morning where the cold cuts through your jacket. I took a deep breath, let it settle. My boots scuffed against the pavement as I walked toward my truck. I'd built my life around control, around keeping things steady. I knew every bolt and gasket in my shop, every expense down to the last cent. I didn't leave things to chance. And yet here I was, caught flat-footed in my own home. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine. The low rumble filled the cab, familiar and steady. I tapped my fingers against the wheel. This wasn't the kind of thing you reacted to. It was the kind of thing you handled. And I was damn sure going to handle it. I drove straight to the shop. The roads were quiet, the sun barely above the rooftops, casting long shadows across the pavement. The smell of oil and hot metal hit me the second I stepped inside, familiar, steady. The kind of place where things made sense. Unlike my house, I flipped the lights on, grabbed the ledger from the counter, and sat at my desk in the back. Didn't even bother taking off my jacket. I wasn't looking at numbers, though. My mind was running through the situation, picking it apart like an engine problem. I wasn't stupid. I'd seen enough men get blindsided by this kind of thing, watch them drink themselves into the ground, lose their money, their pride, let a woman tear them apart piece by piece. That wasn't happening here. I opened my top drawer, pulled out a black notebook. Inside were notes on every account, every spare part, and every damn thing tied to my name. I started making a list: bank accounts, property, legal documents. First order of business: secure my assets. The front door creaked open. Heavy boots on concrete. Clay, my right-hand man, stepped in, shaking the cold off his shoulders. You're here early. Could say the same for you. Had a bad feeling, he muttered, grabbing a wrench off the workbench. Big guy, late 50s, built like a brick wall. Knew his way around an engine better than most. Didn't say much unless it mattered. He set the wrench down, leaned on the counter. Something up. I let out a breath through my nose, tapped my fingers against the desk. Natalie's been screwing some tattoo artist in Austin. Clay grunted. The kind of sound a man makes when he isn't surprised but still disappointed. Damn shame. He picked up the wrench again, turning it over in his hand like he needed something to do. So what's the plan? First, lock things down. Make sure she can't touch my money, the house, nothing. He nodded like that was the only reasonable next step. You need a lawyer? Already on it. Good. He paused, watching me. You want me to make a few calls? See what I can find out. I looked at him for a beat. Clay wasn't the kind of man you asked for favors lightly. But I knew exactly what he meant. He had connections, the kind that didn't show up in phone books. The kind that could dig up things people wanted buried. I exhaled, rubbed my jaw. Yeah. Find out everything you can on this guy. Clay nodded once. No more words needed. He understood. By noon, I had everything moved. Personal files, paperwork, the title to my shop. All locked away in a safe deposit box. Natalie wouldn't get her hands on a damn thing. My money was in a separate account now. If she thought she could screw around and still have my wallet, she was in for a surprise. By 3, Clay sent me a text with a name. Eli Walker. I leaned against the workbench, rolling the name over in my head. Didn't sound like much, but I'd been around long enough to know that men like him, soft-spoken, artsy types, could be just as rotten as the ones who carried switchblades. They just did it quietly. I ran a search on my phone, pulling up his tattoo shop's website. Photos of dark, moody ink jobs, close-ups of hands tracing over skin. One shot of him, sleeves rolled up, eyes looking off like he was contemplating the meaning of life. Christ. I took another sip of coffee, scrolled further. Found a picture of Natalie's wrist. A small, delicate design. Some kind of compass wrapped in flowers. The date underneath it? 2 months ago. I set the cup down slow, like if I moved too fast, I'd break something. She hadn't just been screwing him. She'd been marking herself, leaving reminders. My stomach settled into something cold and hard. I pushed away from the bench, grabbed my jacket. Time to take a drive. The ride to Austin was uneventful. Highway stretched out long and empty, the kind of road where a man could think too much. I didn't. I just kept my hands steady on the wheel. When I pulled up to the shop, the sun was setting, casting long streaks of orange against the brick. The sign over the door read Black Pines Inc. Fancy script, probably overpriced. A couple of bikes parked outside, modern ones, nothing old school. I stepped inside. The place smelled like antiseptic and burned sage. A woman at the front desk looked up, gave me the usual rehearsed smile. You got an appointment? I shook my head. Just looking for Eli Walker. Her smile faded, replaced by something more cautious. He's in the back. I nodded, pushed past the curtain into the back room. There he was, Natalie's soulmate. Thin, covered in ink, sitting on a stool, sketching something in a notebook. He looked up when I walked in, and I watched the recognition hit him like a slow-moving train. Hugo Stewart, I said, my voice low, steady. You know who I am. His fingers twitched on the pencil. He swallowed. Yeah, I do. Good. Saves me the trouble of introductions. He set the notebook down, straightened up like he was trying to look unbothered. Look, man, I stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressive. Just close enough that he felt it. Presence was everything. He shut his mouth. I tilted my head, taking in the shop. Nice place. Bit soft for my taste, but I get it. Women like it, don't they? I let my eyes land back on him. Natalie sure did. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Smart. I took a step closer, lowered my voice. See, here's the thing, Eli. I don't care what kind of poetic, tortured soul bullshit you fed her. I don't care what she told you about me. What I do care about is respect. And you? You just pissed on it. He swallowed again. You got 2 choices, I continued. 1, you pack up and leave her the hell alone. You vanish. No more texts. No more calls. No more sad little, I miss you letters. I paused. Or 2, you keep going, and I make your life real uncomfortable. His fingers clenched into a fist, but he didn't stand. Didn't say a word. I nodded like I already knew his answer. Smart man. I turned, walked toward the door. Stopped just before stepping out. Oh, and Eli? He looked up. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. If I ever see my wife's name inked on your skin, I'll carve it off myself. Then I left. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, but I barely felt it. The engine roared to life as I turned the key, hands steady on the wheel. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I didn't go straight home. Home wasn't mine anymore, not really. The second a man lets another man into his house, his bed, that place stops being his. I wasn't about to sit in that kitchen again, smelling her perfume on the chair across from me, wondering how long she'd been lying to my face. I had better things to do. I pulled into the shop's lot, killed the engine, and sat there for a minute, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. The night air had that bite to it, the kind that seeps into your bones if you let it. I rolled my shoulders, let out a slow breath. Time to start tightening the screws. Inside, Clay was still there, leaning against the workbench, a fresh cigarette hanging from his lips. He flicked his eyes up when I walked in. That was fast. I grabbed a beer from the mini-fridge, twisted the cap off, and took a long pull. Had a nice chat. Clay smirked. You didn't put him through a window, so I'm guessing it went well. I let the silence answer. He nodded like he understood. I didn't need to explain. He knew men like Eli, soft hands, soft voice, the kind that got women caught up in fantasies. But fantasies didn't hold up when they had to look reality in the eye. I sat on the stool, stretching my legs out, beer bottle dangling from my fingers. Gonna make sure he gets the message loud and clear. Clay let out a dry chuckle. You want me to send a message too? I shook my head. Nothing stupid. Just make sure people start talking. If he's got dirt, I want it. And keep an eye on Natalie. I want to know where she goes, who she talks to. He nodded once, like that settled it. He knew the drill. You don't act out of anger, you act out of strategy. By morning, word had started spreading. Small towns like ours, even if you drove into the city, things traveled fast when you had the right people whispering. Eli might have thought he was deep and untouchable, but men like him didn't do well under pressure. Men like him cracked. I made sure of it. The first thing was his business. The reviews started popping up, subtle at first. A few 1-stars, complaints about cleanliness, about rushed work. Then someone posted a picture of an old tattoo job of his, botched shading, lines that had bled out. Word got around. People started questioning his skill. A guy like him, running on reputation alone, couldn't afford that. Then I made sure his landlord had some concerns. A phone call here, a casual conversation there. Suddenly, the lease he thought was stable wasn't so stable anymore. By the end of the week, Eli Walker had problems. And Natalie? She was spiraling. I'd barely spoken to her since the night I left the house. Cut off communication almost completely. Moved my money, left her no access, no control. It was a quiet kind of punishment, but it worked better than any screaming match ever would. She called me. I let it go to voicemail. She texted, Hugo, we need to talk. I didn't reply. By Friday night, she was waiting for me outside the shop. I pulled into the lot, headlights catching her silhouette. She was wrapped in one of those long sweaters she liked, arms crossed, pacing. The second I stepped out of the truck, she turned, expression tight. Are you just gonna ignore me forever? I shut the door, locked it. Seemed to work for you just fine. Her jaw tensed. You don't get to act like I don't exist. I walked past her, unlocking the shop door. I don't have to act. She followed me in, slamming the door behind her. You can't just disappear and pretend like none of this matters. I let out a slow breath, turned to face her. Natalie, what exactly do you want? Huh? You expecting me to sit down and talk about my feelings? I laughed, shook my head. You made your bed. Hope he's keeping it warm for you. She flinched just like before. I didn't care. Her voice dropped. I messed up. I tilted my head, watching her. That's supposed to mean something to me? She swallowed hard, shifting her weight. I don't know. She exhaled sharply. I don't even know why I did it. Yeah, you do. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You wanted to feel special. You wanted some sad-eyed artist to tell you how deep and misunderstood you are. You wanted romance. And you thought you'd get away with it. Her mouth pressed into a thin line, but she didn't deny it. I let the silence stretch, then pushed off the counter. You don't need to explain anything to me, Natalie. You need to explain it to yourself. She blinked, caught off guard by that. I didn't give her time to recover. I grabbed my jacket off the hook, shrugged it on. Now, if you're done wasting my time, I got better things to do. She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. After a beat, she just nodded, eyes sharp and unreadable. Then she turned and walked out. I watched her go. Didn't stop her. Didn't say a damn thing. She thought she had control in all this. Thought she could steer the situation, maybe even manipulate me into playing along. But what she didn't realize was I wasn't playing her game. I was playing mine. And I was winning. Saturday morning came with a cold wind and the kind of silence that told me everything was falling into place. I drank my coffee slow, leaning against the workbench in the shop, watching the early light creep through the garage doors. Business was steady, my accounts were locked down, and Eli Walker was starting to feel the walls close in. I checked my phone. A few more bad reviews had popped up for his shop overnight. His landlord had given him notice to vacate by the end of the month. It wasn't outright sabotage, just pressure. The kind that made men sweat made them slip up. I finished my coffee, tossed the cup, and grabbed my jacket. Time for the next step. By noon, I was parked outside Black Pines Inc. again, engine idling. I watched through the window as Eli sat behind the counter, face buried in his hands. He looked like hell, eyes sunken, shoulders slumped. Good. I stepped inside. The bell over the door gave a sharp ring, making him jolt upright. His eyes locked on me, and I saw it, the kind of fear a man gets when he realizes he's in way over his head. He stood too fast, nearly knocking over a pile of sketchbooks. "What do you want, man?" His voice wasn't steady. I took my time looking around the shop. "Business not so good?" His jaw tightened. "You got something to do with that?" I let a slow smirk pull at the corner of my mouth. Didn't answer. Didn't have to. His hands clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to say something tough, but men like him didn't know how to throw weight around without hiding behind poetry and sad songs. I stepped closer, keeping my voice level. "You thought this was gonna end some other way?" He exhaled hard through his nose. "I didn't look. I never meant to screw up your life, all right? I didn't go looking for this." "Yeah?" "She just fell into your lap." His face twitched. I saw the guilt. The shame. Didn't make me feel any better. I let my eyes drag over the walls, the tattoo designs, the little pieces of who he was. This whole place was built on some fragile idea of depth, but at the end of the day, he was just another guy who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. "You're leaving town," I said finally. His brow furrowed. "What?" "You heard me. You're packing up, closing shop, and getting the hell out. Otherwise, this pressure? It keeps getting worse." I tilted my head, let the words settle in. "And it doesn't stop at business, either." His throat bobbed. "You threatening me?" I gave him a long look. "I don't make threats. I make decisions. What happens next is yours." His shoulders slumped just a little. The fight was leaving him. I turned, heading for the door. "Clock's ticking, Eli." I didn't look back as I walked out. That night, Natalie showed up again. I was at the shop, finishing up some paperwork when I heard the knock on the door. Slow. Hesitant. I already knew who it was. I pulled it open. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself, eyes tired. "Hugo," she started, voice soft. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting. She shifted. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything." She let out a slow breath, stepping inside without me inviting her. "I saw him today. Eli. He looked awful." "Good for him." She hesitated. "Did you?" I gave her a sharp look. "Did I what?" She shook her head, lips pressing together. She already knew the answer. She walked a few steps, looking around the shop like it was the first time she'd really seen it. Her fingers brushed over the counter, the tools, the grease-stained rags. "Things I used every day, things that built something real." "I didn't mean for all this to happen," she murmured. I exhaled through my nose. "You keep saying that like it means something." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "I miss you." I let the words sit there between us. She expected me to say something, maybe give her a crack to slip through, a weak spot where she could start digging back in. I didn't. She turned, searching my face. "Don't you miss me?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think missing someone erases what they did?" She blinked, like she didn't know how to answer that. I pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. "You didn't just cheat, Natalie. You lied. Every day. Looked me in the eye and fed me bullshit while you ran around with that kid. And now that it's blown up in your face, now you're standing here wanting me to tell you everything's fine? That I miss you." Her breath hitched. I shook my head. "I don't miss you, Natalie. I miss the idea of you. But that woman? She's dead." She sucked in a sharp breath, eyes flashing with something between anger and pain. Maybe she wanted to slap me, maybe she wanted to cry. Either way, it didn't matter. She turned on her heel, heading for the door. I didn't stop her. Before she left, she looked back one last time. "So that's it?" I met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "That's it." She swallowed, nodded once, then walked out. I stood there for a while, listening to the sound of her car fading into the distance. Then I turned back to my work, flipping through the ledger, hands steady. No more waiting. No more words. The game was over. and I was the one walking away. Sunday morning rolled in cold and quiet. The kind of morning where the world felt empty for a little while, like everything was holding its breath. I sat at my desk in the shop, flipping through invoices, but my mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on the fact that I was done. Natalie had walked out for the last time. Eli was crumbling, his shop on the verge of shutting down. I'd taken my time, made sure everything played out exactly the way I wanted. Now it was just cleanup. Clay walked in, tossing his keys onto the counter. Heard your boy Eli's looking for a new spot. Think he got the message? I smirked, setting my pen down. Took him long enough. Clay leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. Heard something else too. I raised a brow. Natalie's looking for a place. Been staying at her sister's since you locked her out. I nodded. Didn't feel much about it one way or the other. She made her bed. That all? Clay hesitated. She went to see a lawyer. That made me stop. Not because I was worried I'd already put everything in place, but because it was pathetic how predictable it all was. She tried guilt, tried nostalgia, and now she was moving to lawyers. I leaned back in my chair. She wants money. Clay shrugged. Probably. I wasn't giving her a damn dime. Everything was in my name. The house, the shop, the accounts. She wasn't getting a cent. I pushed away from the desk, grabbed my jacket. Time to end this. Clay watched me, then gave a slow nod. Need backup? I smirked. If I did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I drove to the lawyer's office in town, parked across the street, and watched. Took my time. Watched Natalie step out looking like she'd lost sleep, looking like she was still figuring out her next move. She wasn't in control anymore. When she was halfway down the block, I got out and caught up to her before she could disappear into some cafe or bookstore. Making this official? She stiffened at the sound of my voice, then turned. Hugo. I waited. She wrapped her arms around herself. I don't want to fight. Then stop picking one. She looked at me like she was searching for something in my face. I just want what's fair. I huffed out a laugh. Fair? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You want to talk fair, Natalie? You want to sit here and act like you deserve half of what I built while you were screwing around behind my back? Her throat bobbed. I was your wife. You stopped being my wife the second you let another man in. Her lip trembled, just a flicker, but I caught it. She swallowed it down fast, though, straightening her shoulders. I gave you years of my life, Hugo. And I gave you loyalty. You don't get to walk away from that and still cash a check. She let out a slow breath, rubbing her hands over her arms. I saw the cracks forming. She wasn't cut out for this. Not really. She thought she could play this game, thought she could manipulate me like she probably did with Eli. But I wasn't him. I leaned in just slightly, lowering my voice. You want to drag this into court? Go ahead. Just know that the second you do, every dirty little secret gets aired out. Her eyes flicked away for half a second. That told me everything. She didn't want that. I straightened. So here's how this ends. You walk away. No lawyers. No bullshit. I keep what's mine, and you get to keep whatever dignity you got left. She stared at me, lips pressed together, eyes burning. You really don't feel anything, do you? I tilted my head, considering that. Not anymore. She exhaled hard, looked away down the street. I could see the fight leaving her, could see reality catching up. She'd lost. I pulled my keys from my pocket. Clock's ticking, Natalie. She swallowed, then nodded once. That was it. No grand speech. No begging. She knew. I left her standing there and didn't look back. By the time I got back to the shop, Clay was waiting, leaning against the counter, flipping through a magazine. He glanced up when I walked in. Handled? I grabbed a water bottle, twisted the cap. Handled. He smirked, shaking his head. Damn shame. She was a looker. I took a drink, shrugged. So's a viper. Doesn't mean you keep one in your house? He chuckled, tossing the magazine aside. Guess that means you're free now. Free. Yeah. It wasn't the word I would have used, but it wasn't wrong either. I looked around the shop at the place I'd built with my own hands. No woman, no distraction, just my work. My rules. And for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly where it should be. A week passed, then another. Life had a way of moving forward whether you were ready for it or not. The shop kept me busy, same as always. Engines didn't care about heartbreak, about betrayal. They just needed fixing. And fixing things was what I did best. Clay and I were finishing up a job when he wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward the front of the shop. Got company. I glanced up. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-40s, sharp eyes, dark red jacket that probably cost more than my truck. I recognized her face from somewhere but couldn't place it right away. She stepped forward, offering a hand. Mila Lee. Journalist. Now I remembered. She wrote for one of those Texas lifestyle magazines, did profiles on small businesses, artists, people with a story to tell. She wasn't the type to walk into a grease-stained garage unless there was a reason. I wiped my hand off before shaking hers. Hugo Stewart. What can I do for you? She gave me a knowing look. I'm actually here about Eli Walker. I kept my expression neutral. That right? She nodded, studying me. I wrote a piece on him a while back. Thought he was an up-and-coming talent, real tragic artist type. But lately I've been hearing different things. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. Like what? She smirked slightly. Like how his business suddenly went under. How he had to break his lease and leave town. How a certain man might have made sure that happened. I didn't say anything. Just held her gaze. She tilted her head. You know, I went back and read that old article. Found something interesting. A mention of a married woman who was his muse. She let the word sit there. That wouldn't happen to be your wife, would it? I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. Ex-wife. She nodded like that confirmed everything. And now she's not my problem. She studied me for a moment like she was trying to decide what kind of man I was. People like Eli, men who think with their feelings instead of their brains, they don't usually see consequences coming until it's too late. I shrugged. Not my fault he couldn't handle the weight. Her smirk widened just a little. No, I suppose not. She pulled out a notepad, flipping it open. You mind if I ask you a few questions? Might be a good angle in there. The man who rebuilt while the other man ran. I snorted. Not much of a story. That depends. You planning on staying buried in this garage forever? I glanced around. The smell of motor oil, the steady hum of tools, the weight of something real in my hands. This place was mine, built with my sweat and time. But there was something in her voice, a challenge almost, like she was waiting for me to prove I wasn't just another bitter divorce collecting dust in a repair shop. I met her eyes. You buy your own drinks, Lee? She arched a brow. Always. Then I'll tell you my story over a beer. She smiled, satisfied. Deal. I grabbed my jacket, nodding at Clay. Lock up when you're done. He smirked. Enjoy your interview. I just shook my head, leading the way outside. The sun was setting, casting the sky in streaks of orange and red. A new chapter, whether I wanted it or not. Natalie was gone. Eli was gone. And me? I was still standing. That was all that mattered. The beer was cold, the bar quiet, the kind of place where the jukebox only played old country and nobody gave a damn who you were as long as you paid your tab. Mila sat across from me, notebook closed, drink half finished. She wasn't taking notes anymore. You don't regret it? She asked, watching me over the rim of her glass. I took a slow sip, let the burn settle. Regret what? She tilted her head. How it all went down. The payback. The way you handled Natalie. You don't ever think about it and wonder if you could have done things differently? I snorted. No. She smirked, leaning back. Just no. I set my glass down. Look, Lee, some men sit around thinking about what they should have done. Some men do it right the first time. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. The bartender came by, refilled our drinks without asking. He was a man who understood how things worked. Some conversations didn't need interruptions. Mila tapped her fingers against the table. You hear what happened to Eli? I hadn't, but I also hadn't been looking. Once a problem was handled, I didn't waste time thinking about it. She smirked. He tried setting up shop in San Antonio. Didn't last a month. Word travels, I guess. I let out a slow exhale, rolling my shoulders. Not my concern. Nope. She swirled the last of her drink. But if it makes you feel better, he's broke and running tattoos out of his buddy's garage now. Pretty far fall from being an artist. I didn't say anything. Just took another sip and let the satisfaction settle in my gut. She glanced at me. And Natalie? Last I heard, she was bouncing between places, working some temp job, living out the consequences of her choices. I had no sympathy. I hadn't heard from her since that last conversation, and I wasn't expecting to. She made her bed. That was the difference between men like me and people like her. I didn't live in fantasy. I dealt in reality. She's out there somewhere, I said finally. Mila nodded like she already knew the answer. And you? What's next? I let my fingers drum against the glass. The shop was running smooth, business was steady, I had my life back in my own hands. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. I smirked. You tell me. You're the journalist. She laughed, shaking her head. I think you're the kind of man who doesn't sit still for too long. She wasn't wrong. The bar door swung open, letting in a gust of night air, carrying the scent of Texas dust and the hum of an old truck rolling down the road. The kind of night that made a man feel like anything was possible. I tossed a few bills on the table, stood up, stretched out my shoulders. Come on, Lee. I'll drive you home. She smirked. Chivalry isn't dead, huh? I shrugged. Nah. Just selective. We stepped out into the night, the neon bar sign flickering behind us. I wasn't a saint, never had been. But I was a man who cleaned up his own mess, who didn't break when life threw a punch. Natalie was a memory. Eli was a mistake erased. And me? I was exactly where I was meant to be. That was the only ending that mattered.